The first time Elena Carter walked into Dante Moretti's office, she reminded herself to breathe. The building itself was intimidating: steel, glass, and silence layered with power. Everyone in the city knew the name Moretti. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was the shadow behind half the legal and illegal businesses on the coast. To the public, he was a sharp-suited entrepreneur with cold charm. To those who truly knew him, Dante Moretti was a mafia boss who ruled without mercy. Elena had promised herself this was only a contract, a transaction with clear terms: 1 year, no emotions, no questions. Dante watched her from behind his desk, his dark eyes unreadable. He noticed everything: the way her fingers tightened around her folder, the slight hesitation in her steps, the quiet strength beneath her nervousness. She wasn't like the women who usually surrounded him. She wasn't chasing wealth or power. She was here because she had no other choice, and that alone intrigued him. He leaned back in his chair, voice calm but commanding, and explained the terms again as if testing her resolve. She would play the role of his partner in public. Appearances at events, meetings, charity galas. Absolute loyalty, absolute discretion. In return, her debts would disappear, her family protected, and her life financially secure. Elena listened carefully, her heart pounding. She knew who he was. Everyone did. Yet here she was, nodding as if she were agreeing to a simple office job. She told herself fear was temporary. Survival required courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. She asked about boundaries, about privacy, about the end of the contract. Dante's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. 1 year, he said firmly. After that, you walk away free. The certainty in his voice convinced her. She signed. From that moment on, her life changed. The first public appearance came sooner than expected: a high-profile charity auction filled with politicians, CEOs, and people who pretended not to know who Dante really was. Elena stood beside him in a black dress chosen by his staff, feeling like she had stepped into someone else's reality. Dante placed a hand at the small of her back, possessive but subtle. Cameras flashed. Whispers followed. The city noticed immediately. The mafia boss had a woman by his side, and no one knew where she had come from. To Dante, Elena was supposed to be a solution, nothing more. His enemies questioned his stability, his personal life. A partner would make him look grounded, human. That was the logic. Yet as the night went on, he found himself distracted. He noticed how Elena smiled politely, how she listened more than she spoke, how she didn't cling to him for attention. When someone made an inappropriate comment, she handled it with quiet dignity. It irritated him how much he noticed these things. Elena, on the other hand, was learning how dangerous Dante's world truly was. She saw how people feared him, how conversations stopped when he entered a room. Yet when he leaned down to murmur instructions to her, his voice softened in a way no one else heard. It confused her. This wasn't part of the contract. He wasn't supposed to care whether she was comfortable or not. As weeks passed, the arrangement settled into a strange rhythm. Elena moved into a secure apartment under his protection. She attended events, learned which questions not to ask, and which names never to mention. Dante remained distant but observant. He never crossed a line, never touched her beyond what was necessary for appearances. That restraint made him more unsettling than if he had been reckless. It was as if he was waiting. One evening, after a long meeting with his associates, Dante found Elena sitting alone in the penthouse living room. Reading. She looked up, startled, and quickly stood. He told her to sit. Silence filled the space. For a moment, they were just two people sharing a room, not a boss and a contract partner. He asked her why she had agreed to the deal. The question caught her off guard. She answered honestly, about her father's medical bills, about the debts that threatened to ruin her family. Dante listened without interruption. Something dark flickered in his eyes, not anger at her, but at the world that had cornered her into this decision. From that night on, his behavior shifted in small, almost invisible ways. He made sure she ate before long events. He had security escort her even within safe spaces. When another man spoke to her for too long, Dante's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Elena noticed. She told herself it was paranoia. This was a business arrangement. He had reminded her of that himself. But Dante was losing control of something he had ruled all his life, his emotions. He didn't like how the thought of the contract ending unsettled him. He didn't like how easily he could picture her leaving, stepping back into a life where he no longer had a say. The idea sparked something dangerous inside him, jealousy, sharp and unfamiliar. He had built his empire on ownership and loyalty. Letting her go after 1 year suddenly felt like weakness. Elena sensed the change, even if she didn't understand it yet. The air between them grew heavier, charged with unspoken tension. She reminded herself of the end date, of the freedom waiting for her. But deep down, a question began to form. What if the contract was the safest part of this entire arrangement? As the city continued to watch them, unaware of the fragile line they were walking, one truth slowly became clear. What started as a simple 1-year deal was becoming something far more dangerous. And neither of them was prepared for what would happen when obsession entered the contract. By the second month of the contract, Elena Carter understood that Dante Moretti's world operated on invisible rules, and breaking even one could be dangerous. Her days followed a strict rhythm now: security briefings in the morning, carefully scheduled appearances, quiet evenings in the penthouse that never truly felt empty despite its silence. Everywhere she went, eyes followed her. Some were curious, some calculating, and some openly hostile. Being the woman beside Moretti came with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Dante noticed this before she did. He noticed the way her shoulders stiffened in public spaces, how she learned to scan rooms the way his men did, and how she pretended not to see the whispers that followed her like shadows. What unsettled him most was that none of it scared her away. She adapted, and that made her valuable in a way money couldn't buy. Dante had built his life on control. People, businesses, outcomes, everything moved according to his will. Yet Elena was different. She didn't bend out of fear or ambition, she complied because she had given her word. That distinction mattered to him more than he liked to admit. During meetings, his attention drifted when he knew she was in the building. He found himself checking security feeds, asking questions he never asked before, making sure no one spoke to her without permission. His men noticed the shift. Whispers began among them, subtle but dangerous. A boss distracted was a vulnerable boss. Dante silenced the rumors with a single look, but the truth lingered. His focus was no longer absolute. Elena tried to maintain emotional distance. She reminded herself daily that this was temporary, that Dante was not her protector out of kindness but obligation. Still, moments slipped through the cracks. Like the night a storm knocked out the city's power, plunging the penthouse into darkness. Elena froze, memories of past hardships rising uninvited. Before she could steady herself, Dante was there, lighting candles, his voice low and calm as he spoke to her, grounding her without touching her. He stayed in the room until the lights returned, saying nothing unnecessary, yet refusing to leave. That night, Elena lay awake wondering why his presence felt safer than it should have. Public events grew more intense. At a private fundraiser, a foreign investor showed too much interest in Elena, ignoring her polite attempts to disengage. Dante watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. When the man reached for Elena's arm, Dante crossed the distance in seconds, his hand settling possessively at her waist. His smile was polite, his words calm, but the warning beneath them was unmistakable. The investor backed away immediately. Elena felt the tension in Dante's grip long after the danger passed. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply escorted her away and ensured she was never alone again that night. Later, Elena confronted him gently, reminding him of the contract's boundaries. Dante listened, jaw tight, then agreed without argument. Yet inside, something dark twisted. The thought of another man touching her, claiming even a moment of her attention, ignited a jealousy he didn't recognize. It wasn't about reputation or appearances. It was personal. That realization unsettled him more than any threat ever had. He began counting time in a way he never had before. Months passed too quickly. 1 year suddenly felt dangerously short. Elena noticed the change in him as well. Dante became more present, more involved in her daily routines. He asked about her past, not interrogations, but real questions. What she liked to read, what music she preferred, what her life had been like before debt and desperation forced her into this agreement. She answered carefully, unsure. How much honesty was safe? With every shared detail, the line between performance and reality blurred. Dante listened as if each word mattered, storing them away like assets he refused to lose. The city reacted, too. Headlines speculated about the mysterious woman who had captured Moretti's attention. Some painted her as a threat, others as a weakness. Elena became aware that her safety depended not just on Dante's protection but on his reputation remaining intact. When a rival group tested boundaries by sending a subtle warning, a message delivered too close to Elena for comfort, Dante responded with ruthless precision. The threat disappeared overnight. Elena never asked what he did. She didn't want to know. But she saw the aftermath in his eyes, darker and colder than before, and realized that her presence had altered the stakes of his world. One evening, as they stood on the penthouse balcony overlooking the city, Dante spoke without looking at her. He said the city was built on illusion, power, loyalty, trust, all temporary. Elena replied that some things only seemed temporary because people were afraid to hold on to them. The silence that followed was heavy. Dante turned to her then, studying her face as if seeing it for the first time. In that moment, he understood something terrifying. The contract had given him access, but it had also given her freedom. She could leave when it ended. And the idea of that freedom slipping through his fingers ignited a possessiveness that bordered on obsession. Elena felt it too. The shift, the intensity, the way his gaze lingered longer than necessary. She told herself to stay cautious. Dante Moretti was not a man to fall for. He was power, danger, and secrets wrapped in charm. Yet as the city lights reflected in his eyes, she wondered if she was already standing too close to the edge. The contract was still intact, the rules unchanged, but something irreversible had begun. What was meant to be a controlled arrangement was turning into a battle neither of them had planned for, a battle between reason and desire, between freedom and possession. And with each passing day, the end of the one-year contract felt less like an exit and more like a breaking point. Neither of them would survive unchanged. By the time the third month arrived, the city no longer whispered about Elena Carter, it openly speculated. She had become a constant presence at Dante Moretti's side, and that consistency made people nervous. In a world ruled by uncertainty, familiarity was dangerous. Elena felt the pressure in subtle ways. Invitations that came with hidden agendas, smiles that didn't reach people's eyes, and questions wrapped in compliments. She learned to navigate it all with calm restraint, but the weight followed her everywhere. Dante watched these interactions closely, memorizing every face that lingered too long on her, every tone that carried disrespect. His patience thinned with each incident, though outwardly he remained composed. Inside, however, a storm brewed. Elena was no longer just part of his image. She had become part of his territory, and threats to her felt personal. Elena tried to focus on the practical side of the contract. She counted days like a silent ritual, marking time as a reminder that this life wasn't permanent. Yet the closer she grew to Dante, the harder it became to imagine leaving without consequence. He wasn't cruel to her, nor was he kind in the way fairy tales described. His care was quiet, deliberate, and overwhelming in its intensity. When she was sick, a doctor appeared without explanation. When she mentioned missing her family, security arrangements were made within hours. Dante never asked for gratitude, but the unspoken expectation lingered, loyalty. The tension between them sharpened during a high-risk business dinner held at a private estate outside the city. Rivals and allies sat at the same table, bound by fragile truces. Elena sensed the danger immediately. Conversations were polite, but every word carried double meaning. Dante kept her close, his hand resting lightly against her back, a silent warning to everyone present. When a rival leader suggested Elena must be, well compensated, for her role, Dante's smile vanished. His response was calm, measured, and devastating. He reminded the table that Elena was under his protection, and protection was not something he offered lightly. The message was clear. Later that night, Elena confronted him again, not in anger, but concern. She asked whether her presence was putting him at risk. Dante's answer surprised her. He said risk had always been part of his life, but losing control wasn't. For the first time, he admitted that the contract had become more complicated than he expected. He didn't define how. He didn't need to. The implication hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Elena felt a mixture of fear and something dangerously close to sympathy. She reminded him, gently, that complications ended when the contract did. The word, ended, echoed longer than it should have. Dante began to change his routines. He shortened meetings, delegated tasks he normally controlled himself, and spent more time in spaces where Elena was present. His men noticed, and this time, the concern was no longer whispered. One trusted associate warned him that attachment was a liability. Dante dismissed him without argument, but later, alone, the words returned. He had eliminated threats his entire life without hesitation. The idea that Elena could be won, not by intent but by existence, disturbed him deeply. Elena's internal conflict grew just as intense. She told herself she was grateful, not attached. That she admired his discipline, not the man himself. Yet when Dante was absent for several hours longer than expected, she felt an unease she couldn't explain. When he returned with blood on his sleeve and exhaustion in his eyes, she fought the instinct to ask questions or reach for him. This was not love. This was survival mixed with proximity, she insisted. But denial only went so far. The breaking point came unexpectedly. A woman from Dante's past appeared at a public event, openly familiar, her intentions unmistakable. She spoke to Elena with thinly veiled condescension, implying that Elena's position was temporary, replaceable. Dante observed from a distance, his expression unreadable. Elena maintained her composure, but the encounter left a bitter taste. Later, she mentioned it casually, not accusing, just stating facts. Dante's reaction was swift and cold. He cut ties with the woman completely, severing business and personal connections without hesitation. Elena was shocked. She hadn't asked for that. She hadn't expected it. That night, the distance between them collapsed. Not physically, but emotionally. Words were exchanged, carefully chosen, restrained, but loaded. Dante admitted he disliked the idea of her being seen as temporary. Elena countered that temporary was the foundation of their agreement. The contradiction hung in the air, unresolved. Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. Instead, he said something far more dangerous, that some agreements outgrew their original terms. Elena retreated emotionally after that, pulling back where she could. She reminded herself that Dante Moretti was not a man whose obsessions ended gently. She began planning for life after the contract, quietly researching opportunities, imagining a future far from his world. But Dante sensed the shift immediately. Her distance triggered something raw in him, a fear he refused to name. The idea of her preparing to leave ignited jealousy sharper than before, not aimed at another man, but at the future itself. As the months continued to slip away, both of them stood at opposite sides of an invisible line. Elena clung to the promise of freedom, even as her emotions betrayed her. Dante clung to control, even as it slipped through his fingers. The contract remained unchanged on paper, but in reality, it was unraveling, thread by thread, pulling them toward a confrontation neither of them could avoid. What had begun as a one-year arrangement was now a test of will, and obsession was no longer a possibility. It was already there, watching, waiting for the moment everything would finally break. By the fourth month, the contract felt less like an agreement and more like a countdown ticking inside both of them, loud even in silence. Elena Carter had become skilled at masking her emotions, but the strain was beginning to show in small, human ways, longer pauses before speaking, restless nights, a distant look in her eyes that Dante noticed immediately. He had always been able to read people with frightening accuracy, and what he read in her unsettled him. She was preparing for a future that did not include him. That realization cut deeper than any betrayal. Dante responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control. Security doubled. Schedules became stricter. He framed it as protection, but Elena felt the invisible walls closing in. Elena confronted him one quiet evening, choosing her words carefully. She reminded him that increased restrictions were not part of the contract. Dante listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. He said the world around them had become more dangerous, and his responsibility was to ensure her safety. Elena countered that safety without freedom felt like captivity. The word hung between them, sharp and accusatory. Dante's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he said something that unsettled her more. He asked her whether she trusted him. Elena hesitated, and that hesitation spoke louder than any answer. The tension spilled into their public appearances. People sensed it, even if they didn't understand it. Dante grew more possessive in subtle ways, standing closer, touching longer, asserting his presence without explanation. Elena maintained her composure, but internally she struggled. Part of her understood his fear, another part resented it. She had entered this agreement to save her family, not to lose herself. The line between gratitude and obligation blurred more each day. Behind the scenes, Dante's world grew more unstable. Rivals tested him, sensing vulnerability. A shipment was intercepted, a meeting leaked, a warning delivered too close to Elena for comfort. Dante responded with calculated force, but the pattern was clear: his enemies believed Elena was leverage. That knowledge ignited a ruthless side of him he hadn't unleashed in years. Anyone who saw her as a weakness would be eliminated. The thought was cold, logical, and terrifying in its clarity. Elena became aware of the escalating danger not through words, but through atmosphere. The penthouse felt heavier, filled with unspoken tension. Dante returned late more often, his silence darker, his patience thinner. One night, she noticed blood on his knuckles. She asked if he was hurt. He said it was nothing. The lie was obvious. For the first time, Elena felt fear not of him, but for him. That realization shook her more than anything else. Their dynamic shifted after a private gala that went disastrously wrong. A rival made a veiled threat disguised as a toast, referencing Dante's attachments. Elena felt Dante's grip tighten instantly. The room held its breath. Dante responded with a smile that never reached his eyes, turning the threat into a public humiliation for the rival. Applause followed, but the danger lingered. On the drive home, silence pressed down on them. Elena finally broke it, saying she didn't want to be the reason blood was spilled. Dante's reply was immediate and chilling: no one touched what was his without consequences. The possessiveness in his tone left no room for misunderstanding. That night, Elena set boundaries more firmly than before. She reminded him that she was not an object, not a bargaining chip, and not permanent. Dante listened, every word carving deeper into him. He admitted, quietly, that the idea of losing her was becoming unacceptable. The honesty shocked her. This wasn't manipulation, it was confession. Elena felt torn between empathy and self-preservation. She told him that obsession was dangerous, for both of them. Dante didn't deny it. As days passed, Elena began planning her exit more seriously. She contacted an old friend discreetly, exploring options for work far from the city. Each step toward independence felt necessary, yet painful. Dante sensed the shift without evidence. His jealousy was no longer reactive, it became anticipatory. He watched her closely, not out of suspicion of betrayal, but fear of abandonment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He ruled through fear, yet now he was the one afraid. The breaking point arrived unexpectedly during a rare moment of vulnerability. Dante admitted he had built his empire by never needing anyone. Elena responded that needing someone didn't make him weak, it made him human. The words struck something deep. For a brief moment, the mask slipped, revealing a man shaped by loss and control. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar cold composure. He told her he would not force her to stay beyond the contract. The promise sounded hollow, even to him. As the fourth month ended, both of them stood at a dangerous crossroads. Elena clung to the belief that leaving was still possible, even necessary. Dante clung to the illusion that control could replace acceptance. The contract remained intact, but its spirit was shattered. Obsession had moved from shadow to center stage, shaping every decision, every glance, every silence. What neither of them realized yet was that the most dangerous part of obsession wasn't possession, it was the moment it realized it might fail. The fifth month arrived with a fragile calm that felt more dangerous than open conflict. A quiet tension stretched thin between Elena Carter and Dante Moretti, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Elena moved through her days with careful restraint, aware that every word and gesture carried weight. She had learned how to exist within Dante's world without provoking it, but the cost was growing heavier. Her plans to leave remained hidden, folded neatly into private thoughts and encrypted messages sent only when she was sure no one was watching. She told herself secrecy was protection, not betrayal, yet guilt followed her like a shadow. Dante, meanwhile, watched her with a patience that masked deepening obsession. He sensed her withdrawal, her careful emotional distance, and it ignited a jealousy that no longer needed a rival to exist. The idea that she was preparing a life beyond him consumed his thoughts more than any enemy ever had. Public appearances became exercises in control. Dante maintained the image of confidence, but his possessiveness sharpened. He positioned himself between Elena and others, answered questions meant for her, and guided conversations away from any hint of her independence. To outsiders, it looked like devotion. To Elena, it felt like erasure. She confronted him again, reminding him that she had not agreed to disappear behind his shadow. Dante listened, eyes dark, then responded with unsettling honesty. He said the world didn't forgive weakness, and caring about her had already exposed him. The words struck her harder than any accusation. She realized that in his mind, her freedom and his safety were no longer compatible. The city reacted as cities always did, to power shifts, rumors, and fear. Dante's enemies grew bolder, pushing boundaries, sending messages meant to unsettle. One threat arrived in the form of an anonymous delivery left too close to Elena's apartment, containing nothing illegal, nothing explicit, just enough to prove access. Dante's response was immediate and brutal. He dismantled the network responsible within days. Elena saw the aftermath in his eyes, exhaustion layered with cold satisfaction. She understood then that as long as she remained near him, violence would follow. The realization hardened her resolve. Leaving wasn't just about her freedom anymore, it was about survival. Yet emotions are rarely logical. Despite everything, moments of closeness slipped through defenses. One night, during a rare quiet evening, Dante spoke about his childhood, not in detail, but enough to reveal isolation, loss, and a life shaped by necessity rather than choice. Elena listened without judgment, her guard lowering despite herself. In that moment, she saw not a mafia boss, but a man who had never learned how to hold on to something without claiming it. The understanding hurt more than anger ever could. The following day shattered the fragile balance. A former associate approached Elena privately at a public event, offering sympathy disguised as concern. The implication was clear: Dante's world was dangerous, and Elena should consider leaving while she could. Dante intervened before the conversation went too far, his presence immediate and overwhelming. Later, he confronted Elena, not about the conversation itself, but about the possibility it raised. His jealousy flared openly for the first time. He accused her of entertaining ideas of escape. Elena didn't deny it. She told him the truth, that the contract was ending, and she intended to leave. The honesty hit him like a physical blow. Dante reacted with controlled fury. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He did something far more unsettling. He withdrew emotionally, becoming distant and cold. Elena felt the shift immediately. The warmth, however dangerous, vanished, replaced by something calculating. She realized that Dante was reassessing the situation, not emotionally, but strategically. The thought terrified her more than anger ever could. Days passed in tense silence. Dante limited their interactions, communicating through staff and schedules. Elena felt the isolation keenly, the absence louder than presence. She wondered if she had miscalculated, if honesty had accelerated a dangerous outcome. Yet she refused to retreat. She finalized her plans quietly, securing a job opportunity abroad under an assumed timeline. Each step felt like reclaiming herself, even as fear tightened its grip. The confrontation came unexpectedly, late one night. Dante entered the penthouse without warning, his composure brittle. He admitted he had considered ending the contract early, not to free her, but to remove the distraction. The admission chilled her. She realized how close she had come to being erased from his life without a trace. She responded with equal honesty, telling him that obsession was turning him into the very thing he claimed to despise, weakness masked as control. The words cut deep. For a moment, Dante looked genuinely lost. That night marked a turning point. Dante began to understand the cost of his obsession, not in abstract terms, but through the very real possibility of losing her completely. Elena, in turn, saw the depth of his internal conflict. Neither of them was innocent. Neither of them was entirely wrong. The contract, once a clear boundary, now felt like a fragile thread holding back chaos. As the fifth month closed, the city held its breath. Dante Moretti stood at the edge of a choice: tighten his grip and risk destroying the one person who mattered, or let go and face a loss he had never prepared for. Elena stood equally torn, balancing fear with hope, independence with unresolved emotion. Obsession had reached its most dangerous stage, not explosive, but quiet, deliberate, and capable of changing everything with a single decision. The sixth month began with an uneasy truce, the kind that existed not because conflict had ended, but because both sides were too aware of what another clash might destroy. Elena Carter moved through the penthouse with renewed caution, every sound and shadow reminding her that she was standing inside a man's empire at the exact moment it was beginning to crack. Dante Moretti, for his part, became quieter, more controlled than ever before, which only made him more dangerous. He had stopped reacting impulsively, and Elena sensed that something deeper was taking place behind his calm exterior. Obsession, once raw and visible, was now being disciplined, reshaped into something colder and more deliberate. That frightened her more than anger ever had. Dante threw himself back into work, reclaiming the ruthless efficiency that had built his power. Meetings stretched late into the night, alliances were renegotiated, and enemies were neutralized with surgical precision. To the outside world, it looked as though he had regained control. In truth, everything he did was filtered through one unspoken question: how much of this world could Elena survive if she chose to stay, and how much damage would follow if she left? He began to imagine both futures in unsettling detail. In one, she remained by his side, protected but bound, safe yet never free. In the other, she disappeared from his reach, taking with her the one vulnerability his enemies could never exploit again. Neither outcome felt acceptable. Elena noticed the shift immediately. Dante no longer hovered, no longer asserted his presence through proximity. Instead, he observed from a distance, his attention sharp and constant. Security patterns changed subtly, routes adjusted, access points restricted. It felt less like protection and more like preparation. Elena confronted him cautiously, asking whether something had changed. Dante replied that he was ensuring contingencies. The word sent a chill through her. Contingencies implied outcomes she might not survive unscathed. Despite the tension, moments of humanity broke through in unexpected ways. One evening, during a rare power outage, Dante found Elena sitting alone again, just as she had months earlier. This time, he joined her without speaking, sitting across from her rather than beside her. The silence was different, less charged, more reflective. He admitted that he had never planned for an ending. Contracts ended, deals closed, people came and went, but Elena's departure felt like erasure. Saying it aloud stripped the words of their power and left him exposed. Elena listened, torn between compassion and fear. She told him that love born from fear of loss could become a prison. Dante didn't disagree. The city, however, was not interested in emotional reckonings. A coordinated attack on one of Dante's legitimate businesses sent a clear message: his rivals believed his attention was divided again. The timing was not coincidental. Elena realized she was still the silent variable in every calculation. Dante handled the situation with ruthless efficiency, but the incident forced an uncomfortable truth into the open. As long as she remained, she would be used against him. As long as she mattered, she would be a target. Elena made a decision that night. She told Dante she intended to leave before the contract ended. Not immediately, but soon. The words landed like a controlled detonation. Dante didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He simply asked when. That question alone revealed how much he had already anticipated this moment. Elena gave a vague answer, unwilling to commit to a timeline she wasn't sure she could survive. Dante nodded, accepting it with a composure that felt almost unnatural. After that conversation, Dante changed again. He began teaching Elena how to protect herself, not physically but strategically. He explained how to read rooms, how to recognize danger before it announced itself, how to disappear without leaving a trace. Elena realized then that he wasn't preparing to keep her, he was preparing to let her go without destroying her. The realization hit her harder than any declaration of love could have. It was the first truly selfless act he had offered her. Their interactions grew quieter, more intentional. No unnecessary touches, no possessive gestures, just conversations filled with things that had gone unsaid for too long. Dante admitted that obsession had nearly cost him everything he valued, including his own sense of identity. Elena admitted that she had underestimated how deeply proximity could change people. They were no longer pretending the contract defined them. It was merely the reason they had met. But obsession does not fade quietly. One night, Dante learned that a rival had learned of Elena's planned departure. The information alone was dangerous. The rival didn't intend to stop her, they intended to follow her. Dante eliminated the threat before dawn, leaving no trace. Elena never learned the details, only that Dante arrived home shaken, his restraint visibly strained. In that moment, she saw how thin the line truly was between protection and destruction. As the 6th month came to an end, both of them understood that time was no longer their ally. Dante stood at the edge of letting go, knowing it would be the hardest act of control he had ever attempted. Elena stood at the edge of freedom, knowing it might come at the cost of a man who had risked everything to keep her safe, even from himself. Obsession had not vanished, it had evolved, sharpening into something more dangerous than possession, sacrifice. And neither of them knew whether it would save them or ruin them when the contract finally ran out. By the 7th month, the tension between Elena Carter and Dante Moretti had reached a point where every interaction carried weight, where silence could speak louder than words, and where the city outside their fortress seemed both distant and dangerously close. Elena had become adept at maintaining appearances, mastering the delicate balance of being visible yet untouchable, polite yet firm. She moved through public events with the same grace that had first drawn Dante's attention, but now each smile and gesture was measured, a conscious defense against the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Dante, for his part, had learned to contain the obsession that had grown over the past months, transforming raw emotion into a meticulous, quiet control. Yet that control was like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. He no longer merely watched her. He monitored, calculated, and anticipated, reading her expressions, movements, and even the pauses in her speech for signs of intent, for clues about when she might slip from his grasp. Elena understood, more clearly than ever, that she was a living variable in Dante's world, a world built on power, fear, and absolute precision. Every step she took, every word she spoke, had consequences she could not always foresee. She reminded herself daily that this was temporary, that the contract was a line drawn in ink and law, but she also knew the truth: contracts could not contain obsession. Dante's attention had moved beyond obligation, it had become personal, and she could feel the weight of it pressing in subtle, inescapable ways. There were moments when he would appear in a room unexpectedly, not to confront or command, but simply to be present, a silent guardian whose gaze made her acutely aware of her vulnerability. And yet, paradoxically, that presence offered comfort too, a contradiction that confused and unsettled her in equal measure. The 7th month was marked by an escalation of external threats that reflected the growing internal tension between them. Rivals who had long tested Dante's patience began to push boundaries again, assuming that his attention was fractured, that the obsession with Elena might compromise his judgment. One evening, a discreet warning arrived, a subtle, anonymous signal meant to unsettle her. Dante intercepted it before she even realized, eliminating the risk without fanfare. The sight of him returning, composed yet visibly tense, revealed a side of him Elena rarely saw, a man who would go to any lengths to protect what he considered his, even when logic suggested restraint. That night, as they sat across from one another in the penthouse, silence stretched long and heavy between them. Neither spoke of the incident. Words were unnecessary. Each understood the other's thoughts, fears, and determination without uttering them. Emotions, however, are rarely contained by logic or strategy. Despite all precautions, Elena began to feel the pull of connection, a subtle, insidious attraction that threatened her careful detachment. She reminded herself constantly of the 1-year limit, the exit plan she had meticulously crafted. Yet Dante's influence seeped into her consciousness, not through force but through attention, protection, and an undeniable sense of presence. She found herself imagining life with him not as a threat, but as a possibility, a dangerous fantasy she could not allow herself to indulge. Dante, meanwhile, wrestled with his own growing awareness that obsession was no longer about control or possession, but fear. Fear of losing her, of failing her, of facing a world in which she existed without him. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, destabilizing the careful order he had built around his life. The breaking point came during a charity gala held in the city's grandest hall. Elena had been warned in advance that the event might attract unwanted attention from rivals. Dante positioned himself strategically, his presence both protective and possessive. Throughout the evening, subtle threats emerged, glances, whispers, gestures aimed at testing boundaries. Elena maintained her composure, deflecting attention with grace, but each encounter reminded her of the stakes involved. Dante observed, intervening with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. When a man approached Elena with inappropriate familiarity, Dante's response was immediate, placing himself between them in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. The man withdrew, visibly shaken, while Elena felt a complex mix of fear, gratitude, and something far more dangerous, attachment. After the event, the tension between them could no longer be contained. Elena confronted Dante privately, challenging him to acknowledge the obsession she had long suspected. She spoke calmly but firmly, reminding him that the contract was supposed to define boundaries, that obsession was a dangerous and unpredictable force. Dante listened, his dark eyes unreadable, then admitted something he had never said before, that he could not simply let her leave, that the idea of her freedom was unbearable, and that his feelings had long since exceeded what the contract allowed. The confession stunned her. It was not a declaration of love in the romantic sense, but a revelation of the raw, unfiltered reality. Dante Moretti, a man who controlled empires, feared losing her more than any business, any rival, any power he had ever claimed. In the days that followed, both of them navigated a precarious balance. Dante's obsession became subtler, refined, yet more dangerous. It was no longer expressed through overt possessiveness, but through calculated actions designed to ensure her safety and presence without breaking the contract outright. Elena, in turn, found herself negotiating internally, wrestling with loyalty, gratitude, and the creeping awareness that her departure would not leave either of them unchanged. She realized that leaving would not simply be an exit, it would be a rupture, a confrontation with the obsession that had grown far beyond agreement, far beyond control. External pressures mirrored the internal chaos. Rival factions, sensing Dante's preoccupation, escalated their strategies, testing security, influence, and reach. Elena became acutely aware of her role, not as a pawn, but as a catalyst, the singular presence that had reshaped Dante's focus, priorities, and vulnerabilities. She understood that every move she made had consequences, and every choice was fraught with danger. Dante, meanwhile, responded with cold, precise efficiency, neutralizing threats while simultaneously managing the delicate tension between his obsession and the contract that technically allowed her freedom. It was a dangerous dance, and both were acutely aware that a single misstep could ignite irreversible consequences. As the 7th month drew to a close, both Elena and Dante understood the fragile reality they inhabited. Obsession was no longer a secret or a passing shadow, it had become the axis around which their lives now revolved. The contract, once a clear framework, had evolved into a tenuous line between desire, control, fear, and freedom. Each day brought new challenges, external and internal, that tested not only their patience and restraint but also their understanding of themselves and one another. Elena knew that leaving would require courage, strategy, and sacrifice, while Dante knew that letting go, even in accordance with the contract, could expose the vulnerability he had never experienced before. Both were caught in a complex web of emotion and consequence, fully aware that the end of the year could either bring liberation or destruction, and that obsession, now fully awakened, would dictate the terms of what came next. By the time the city lights faded each night, both of them were left with the same unspoken truth. The one-year contract was no longer a measure of time, but a countdown to the moment when obsession would demand its resolution, and neither of them could predict whether it would save or ruin them. The 8th month arrived with an intensity that neither Elena Carter nor Dante Moretti could ignore. The contract, which had begun as a simple arrangement, had long since become a complicated web of emotions, obligations, and unspoken desires. Elena felt the weight of every glance, every gesture, every calculated action Dante took around her. He moved with the precision of a man accustomed to control, yet she could sense the undercurrent of obsession threading through every decision. Every security adjustment, every subtle warning, every protective measure revealed his struggle. The fear of losing her had overtaken his desire to remain detached. For Elena, it was both terrifying and intoxicating. She reminded herself constantly that the contract had an expiration date, that her freedom was promised, and that attachment, even his, was not her concern. And yet, the longer she stayed, the more she realized that freedom was a fragile illusion. Dante, meanwhile, had begun to calculate time differently. Each passing day was no longer just another step toward the contract's end, it was a countdown toward an inevitable confrontation with reality. He had come to recognize that obsession was not just a dangerous emotion but a form of vulnerability. He could manage his empire, neutralize threats, and command loyalty, but the thought of Elena leaving created a weakness he had never experienced. He found himself studying her, not with the cold detachment of a strategist, but with the intense scrutiny of a man grappling with a reality he could not control. Every subtle change in her demeanor, every hint of hesitation, every word carefully chosen became evidence of plans he could not yet anticipate. The city's pulse mirrored the tension in their lives. Rivals and observers, sensing Dante's preoccupation, began to test the limits of his focus. One night, an anonymous threat was delivered to Elena's apartment, an overt but carefully concealed warning of potential danger. Dante responded without hesitation, his actions precise and ruthless, eliminating the source before it could escalate. Elena learned of this only in fragments, enough to understand the seriousness without grasping the full scope. She realized, then, that proximity to Dante was both safety and risk, a paradox she had to navigate with care. Despite the external pressures, moments of vulnerability broke through. One evening, Dante found Elena on the balcony, staring at the city lights in silence. He joined her, remaining quiet at first, his presence a heavy but comforting weight. Slowly, in fragments of conversation, he admitted that the contract had become far more than a professional arrangement, it had become an emotional anchor he could neither deny nor release. Elena listened, aware of the precarious balance, yet unable to retreat emotionally entirely. They spoke not of love or romance but of human fragility, of attachments formed under duress, and of the consequences of obsession. The conversation left both of them exhausted and alert, aware that the clock was moving relentlessly toward the end of the agreement. As the month progressed, Dante's actions became even more deliberate. He watched, not to control, but to anticipate. Every interaction Elena had with others was subtly guided, every exposure to potential threats minimized. Yet these protective measures were infused with emotion he did not fully acknowledge, fear, possessiveness, and an obsession that had silently taken root. Elena, aware of the changes, navigated them carefully, trying to maintain independence while recognizing the genuine concern underlying his behavior. It was a delicate balance of trust and caution, each aware that the slightest misstep could have catastrophic consequences. The turning point came during a high-profile gala where tensions outside the penthouse intersected with their private reality. Elena was approached by a business associate with hidden intentions, testing boundaries as rivals often did. Dante, observing from a distance, intervened without dramatic confrontation, his mere presence enough to enforce unspoken rules. The encounter underscored the duality of their lives, public appearances that demanded composure, and private stakes that threatened life, freedom, and stability. Elena realized that even with her careful planning, she existed in a reality controlled by forces far beyond her initial understanding. Dante understood too, that every action to protect her deepened the roots of obsession he could not undo. By the 8th month, both recognized that the contract was no longer a structure of legal terms but a countdown to inevitable choices. Elena's exit, once a clear and attainable goal, was complicated by her awareness of Dante's obsession, his genuine care, and the danger surrounding them both. Dante's obsession had evolved, moving beyond mere possession to a calculated intensity, where every decision was filtered through the lens of her presence and potential absence. Neither could fully articulate their feelings, neither could fully disentangle the contract from the emotions that had quietly grown between them. As the month drew to a close, the stakes intensified. A rival faction attempted a subtle but precise attack on Dante's operations, testing his focus while Elena was nearby. He responded with the cold, methodical ruthlessness that had built his empire, but every move was informed by the need to protect her as much as the business. Elena, witnessing this, understood fully the power of obsession, not in romance, but in survival, influence, and control. It was clear that the contract had already failed to contain what had grown between them. Obsession was no longer a shadow, it was the central axis around which their lives revolved. In private moments, they began to confront the inevitable. Elena acknowledged that her departure would have consequences beyond her own life, affecting Dante's control, his reputation, and the delicate equilibrium of his empire. Dante acknowledged that letting go would expose his vulnerabilities in ways he could not tolerate. The contract, which had once promised clarity and boundaries, now existed as a fragile illusion against the reality of obsession, emotion, and interdependence. They faced each other across rooms, through conversations, and in silence, understanding fully that the year-long agreement had already evolved into something irreversible. By the end of the 8th month, both Elena and Dante were acutely aware of the inevitable truth: the one-year contract was no longer a measure of time but a countdown to confrontation. Obsession had taken root in ways that neither could fully control. Dante feared losing her, not just because of attachment but because her absence would expose a vulnerability he had never known. Elena feared both for herself and for the fragile balance of their lives. As the month closed, The reality was clear. The contract would end, but the consequences of obsession, desire, and power would not. Both were standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that when the countdown reached its conclusion, nothing would remain unchanged, and the choices they made in the final months would define not only the remainder of the contract but the course of both their lives forever.